In this series of videos, I'll be going over my theory that Plato secretly patterned the plot structure of his most famous dialogue, The Republic, on Euripides' most famous play, his tragic play, The Bacchae. So that literary parallel inverts the surface meaning of The Republic, and I will argue that the complementary relationship between the surface reading and the subtext provides a more complete literary model of the ultimate idea of the good, the source of all being, which we must see with the eye of the soul in order to live a just life. That's the main theory, and I introduced this theory in my thesis for a Master's of Liberal Studies degree at Georgetown University, entitled In Defense of Plato, a response to Al Gore's book, Earth in the Balance, Ecology and the Human Spirit. So this is a thesis submitted to the faculty of the School of Continuing Studies and of the Graduate School of Arts and Sciences in partial fulfillment of the requirements for the degree of Master of Arts in Liberal Studies. So that was Georgetown University, April 30, 2008, and my mentor was Francis Ambrosio. So the thesis was a response to Al Gore, his best-selling book, Earth in the Balance, Ecology and the Human Spirit. He diagnosed the spiritual crisis behind the ecological crisis as a philosophical disease that he traced back to Plato. And his main argument was Plato's theory that the human soul, or the psyche, is separate from the body, and the body is a prison for the soul, engendered this earth-hating mentality that infected early Christianity and then was adopted by René Descartes and Francis Bacon in the Enlightenment, and that the scientific revolution, which gave us godlike power over nature, at the same time having this Platonic inheritance of earth-hating, an earth-despising idea that the soul is separate from the body and should escape from the body at all costs. He said that is what led to the ecological crisis, and that we use our godlike technological power to devour the earth, to fill the hole in our souls where our spiritual relationship with the earth used to be prior to Plato. So, and then he says that the antidote to Plato is brought to us by quantum physics, and he cites Heisenberg, for example, and the technology of holography that's based on quantum physics. And not according to, but the holographic technology is such that on a holographic film plate, all of the information of the whole is located in each little segment. So that if you shine a laser on any little fragment of that holographic film, you'll see a three-dimensional image produced. The main point is that God is present in every point of nature completely, although we need to develop the mind's eye to see God. And Gore says the ultimate goal of philosophically reuniting ourselves with nature via an understanding of quantum physics and holography is to open the mind's eye to God's presence everywhere in nature, bright, shining as the sun. That's a quote. The mind's eye and bright, shining as the sun. That's how we should see God. And I say that Gore's antidote to Plato is actually the acme of Platonic philosophy presented in The Republic, where the ultimate goal of education is to open the eye of the soul to the idea of the good, which is the archetype of the sun. It's the spiritual sun. It's infinitely bright. So the irony is that Al Gore blames Plato for the ecological crisis, and then his antidote is the essence of Platonic philosophy. Nevertheless, there is some good reasoning behind Gore's diagnosis of our spiritual crisis, and I think ultimately his argument stems back to Friedrich Nietzsche's The Birth of Tragedy in particular. Here's that book, The Birth of Tragedy. And I furthermore suspect that in this first book of Friedrich Nietzsche, although he, like Al Gore, blames the kind of earth-hating mentality on Plato, I think Nietzsche secretly alludes to the realization that Plato secretly patterned the Republic on the Bacchae. He doesn't say it explicitly. Once I discovered this parallel, or believe I discovered this parallel, then I saw on rereading The Birth of Tragedy that I think Nietzsche did too. I think he furthermore was aware of another hidden literary game that Plato played that was pointed out by J.B. Kennedy, The Musical Structure of Plato's Dialogues by J.B. Kennedy, who says all of Plato's dialogues are structured by the mathematical pattern of the Pythagorean musical scale, the 12-note musical scale. And I'll talk about that in another video. But other than Nietzsche's allusions, to my knowledge, no one else has pointed out that Plato paralleled the Republic on the Bacchae. In this video, I'm going to focus just on the overall general plot structure of the Bacchae, and then point out those parts of the Republic where the parallels are most obvious. In other videos, I'll get into the physics of this, of Al Gore's idea of quantum physics, helping us to understand how we are united with nature, something that I believe Plato was aware of. And after this master's degree for Georgetown University, I got a degree, a master's in political science from the University of Hawaii, and then a PhD in philosophy and religion, with a concentration in philosophy, cosmology, and consciousness from the California Institute of Integral Studies, where I then discovered the next step of this holographic principle based on quantum physics, which is holographic string theory, which was championed especially by the retired Stanford physicist Leonard Susskind. And I point out how that brought academic physics full circle back to Plato's cosmology. In a nutshell, according to Plato's cosmology, which you can discern by accumulating his various descriptions of the cosmos in different dialogues, especially the Timaeus, the Phaedrus, and the Republic, there's a universal soul in the central point of the universe, which also exists at each point of the encompassing sphere of the universe. And the absolute eternal forms of knowledge, the absolute ideas from which the temporary forms are projected, exist out at that outermost sphere. The past, the present, and the future of the entire material universe are conserved out at this outermost horizon. That's what Plato says. That's what holographic string theory says. And it's projected inward on, according to string theory, on these fundamental elastic strings of energy, which create the cinematic hologram of three-dimensional space. Those threads of energy, I believe, are alluded to by Plato in the myth of Earth, the end of the Republic, a near-death experience. And I will get into all of that, and I've made other series of videos about these specific points, holographic string theory, how it parallels Plato's cosmology, as well as Carl Jung's cosmology that he worked out with Wolfgang Pauli, the co-founder of quantum physics. In this video, I'm just going to focus on these literary parallels, because that's the big new thing that I'm presenting and I haven't presented in previous videos. So, Euripides played the Bacchae. As Nietzsche tells us in The Birth of Tragedy, Euripides and Socrates were friends. So Socrates was executed in 399 BCE on charges of corrupting the youth and believing in gods of his own invention instead of the gods recognized by the state. Plato was one of Socrates' disciples. He left Athens in the aftermath of that execution, the historical context of which is pertinent for the literary parallels that I'll be talking about. Then he returned about a dozen years later and established the first academy in an olive grove named Academus, just northwest of Athens. That was the beginning of academia. So Euripides, he left Athens in 408 BCE, apparently depressed and in anguish, and he died in 406, and in the interim he wrote his three last tragic plays, which his son Euripides the Younger brought back to Athens, and it won Euripides first prize at the festival for the god Dionysus, the Dionysia. So different tragic playwrights would compete. Each would write three plays, and then they'd each have a comic play, and then whichever one was the best would win. So Euripides won first prize at the Dionysia for this play, the Bacchae. And here's the plot structure. It begins with the god Dionysus returning from Asia with his horde of women devotees, the Bacchantes, the Bacchae. And he is standing in front of the tomb of his mother Semele, and is still smoldering with the lightning bolt fire which killed her. And he explains. And there's ivy growing around the tomb, which Dionysus caused to grow himself magically. That's one of the symbols of the god, ivy. And he explains that the people of Thebes denied his divinity. So here's the story. And then I'll also have to bring in the idea of the Orphic version versus the public version of the myth. So according to the public version of the myth, which Euripides describes, Dionysus was the son of the mortal woman Semele, who was the daughter of Cadmus, who was the king of Thebes at the time. And Zeus got her pregnant. Hera, Zeus's ever jealous sister bride, always tries to kill the offspring that Zeus has with other women, mortal women, or a goddess such as Persephone, which is the Orphic version of the myth, which I'll tell in a minute. Both are alluded to in Euripides' play. But according just to the reading of the play, the Bacchae, Dionysus comes back and he explains that the town of Thebes denied his divinity. They said that Semele's father, Cadmus, made up the story of her being impregnated by Zeus to cover up her lusty shame. And in fact, Zeus says that, and here's some subtext which wasn't included in Euripides' play, Hera induced Semele, tricked her into asking Zeus to show her his original form, which is a lightning bolt. He promised to give her whatever she asked for. She said, "Let me see your original form." So he had to keep his promise. He is a lightning bolt, and that incinerated her. That was Hera's intention, to kill her and her offspring. But at the very moment that Zeus incinerated her, he also grabbed Dionysus out of her womb, and he sewed the baby into his own thigh, and then later brought him out of his thigh, and he grew up in the east, from which he's just returned. Now, Cadmus had other daughters, including Agave, who was the mother of Pentheus, King Pentheus, who's a major actor in this play. And Agave and her sisters were saying, "Nah, Semele, our sister, she just slept with a man, and she tried to, Cadmus, our father, came up with this story to try to cover up her shame." So Dionysus says, "I've come to teach Thebes the truth, to avenge my mother's name and to prove that I'm a god. This town lacks initiation in my ceremony." So he drove the women mad, the women of Thebes, including King Pentheus's mother, Agave. Now they've gone out onto Mount Cithron, induced in this manic state of religious psychosis for the god. The course of Asian Bacchae, who are more sober, but still ecstatic, are following Dionysus, and he explains, "I've come from the Bactrian fastness and through Lydia and all of the lands into the east. I've returned here to Greece, and I'll teach Thebes what's up." So then the scene is Tiresias, the old blind prophet, very old, doubled over with age, coming up to the gate of Thebes. And he says, "Open up the gate, tell Cadmus I'm here." And then Cadmus comes down, warmly greets Tiresias, and he's also, like Tiresias, dressed like one of the Bacchantes in a dappled fawn skin, and they have a thyrsus, which is the magic wand of the god, a fennel stalk with ivy tied around it and a pine cone at the tip. There's other versions of it, but it's called a thyrsus. They both have these, and they're doubled over, and they're kind of supporting each other, and they're saying, "Oh, I feel years younger. I could frisk on the mountain." It's not just the young that the god wants to be honored by with dance, the old too, and let's help each other out to the mountain, and we'll dance with the Bacchantes. Now, the Bacchants who were dancing out on the mountain were the Theban women who had been driven mad by the god, also referred to as the Maenads. So Bacchant is a more general term for any devotee of Dionysus, and the Maenads are the women in a state of religious frenzy. And at that point, when Cadmus and Tiresias are there, dressed as Maenads, King Pentheus, an athletic young man, returns to Thebes. He's inherited the throne from Cadmus, and he's determined to bring order when he hears about what he believes are drunken orgies of naked women out on the mountain with this fake religion, a new, who is this Dionysus, he wants to know. And he says, I'll have them arrested, and I'll have this fake prophet of this new god arrested and killed, and he makes all these threats. And then he sees Tiresias and his grandfather, and it's a comical scene, even though it's a tragic play. And he says, what is, Father, shake that ivy off of your head. So they've got crowned with ivy, which is an important symbol. It plays into the parallels with the Republic. And Tiresias and Cadmus say, it's your sick mind that thinks that they're having a drunken naked orgy out there. This is, pay respects to the god. And also, Pentheus, says Cadmus, don't forget what happened to your cousin Actaeon when he blasphemed the goddess Artemis, the goddess of the hunt. She made his own hounds that he raised by hand see him as a stag, and they ripped him to pieces. She said, don't let that happen to you. Worship the god, even if he's not a god, as you say. It's a noble lie, and it brings our family honor. Now that is what Pentheus's mother said was the real situation with Semele's being incinerated by Zeus. Zeus incinerated her as punishment for the blasphemy of claiming that she had his son. Now here is Cadmus, who does believe in Dionysus, but at the same time, he's kind of speaking out of both sides of his mouth, and he's telling Pentheus, even if this mad error that you say turns out to be true, still, just go along with the story because it brings honor to our family, so that he'll be punished for this duplicitousness, this playing both sides of the field at the end of the play. So Pentheus is not dissuaded, and then Tiresias and Cadmus go off to the mountain to be with the Maenads. And in the meantime, Pentheus sends his soldiers out to arrest Dionysus. Now, Dionysus has returned, but he's disguised himself as a man, and that's important in the Republic. In the ideal city-state, there will be no stories of deceptive gods who change forms and lie to people. So there's a point-for-point inversion, as I said before, of the surface reading by this parallel with the Bacchae. So the soldiers go out and they find Dionysus smiling and unresisting, and they bring him back. Dionysus is described as a young man with long blonde hair, no beard. Neither does Pentheus have a beard. Most men had beards, but these were young men with no beards. And he is wearing a smiling mask. So the actors wore masks. Dionysus throughout the whole play wears a smiling, calm, serene mask. Despite all of the havoc he's about to create, his attitude is one of amusement. And so they brought him back and they said, oh, King Pentheus, he didn't even resist. I felt kind of bad arresting the guy. And they brought him back, and then they have this tit-for-tat conversation. And Pentheus says, who do you worship? I worship Dionysus. Where is he? Wherever he wants to be. What form did he take when you saw him? Whatever form he wants. So Dionysus, again, is disguised. And then Pentheus alludes to his suspicion that the religion is just an excuse for these women to get drunk and naked and go and sneak off in the bushes with men and have sex. And Dionysus says, that's your own sick delusion. That's not the case at all. And it wasn't the case, but Pentheus thought it was. And eventually Pentheus gets sick of the conversation, and he gets sick of getting insulted. And he says, oh, you like to have festivals in the dark? Well, I'm going to lock you in the dungeon in the stables underneath the palace where it's dark and with the animals. So there's symbolic meaning to everything in Euripides' play and in Plato's dialogues. The Republic especially is what we're talking about here. Dionysus says, if you manacle me, you manacle the god, and I'll be freed whenever I want. And as soon as he gets ostensibly locked up, he causes an earthquake with lightning, and the entire palace is destroyed. The Asian Bacchae who are there with Dionysus are terrified. And Dionysus comes out of the smoldering ruins, and he's still smiling. And he says, oh, he soothes his devotees. And he says, were you worried? Did you think I wasn't going to help you? And then Pentheus comes back, and he's irate. He goes, what? You escaped from prison? Shall I have you arrested again? And that's an important parallel that we'll see. In the beginning of the Republic, Socrates is arrested by Polemarchus's slave. And then in Book 5, Polemarchus initiates Socrates' arrest again. I'm going to point out a parallel between Polemarchus and King Pentheus. But let me just finish the Bacchae. And then Dionysus says, when Pentheus says, I'm going to have my heavily armored troops attack these maenads, I'm sick of this. Dionysus says, wouldn't you rather see their revels? So an important point that I forgot to mention was just right after the earthquake, a messenger comes back from Mount Cithron, and he said he witnessed some men induced by a city slicker who said to the cow herders and country people out there on Mount Cithron, there's Agave, the king's mother. If we capture her, the king will give us a great reward. What do you guys say? And they said, yeah, let's do it. And so a group of men charged at the maenads, the Theban women who had gone mad, thinking that they would easily kidnap Agave. But with the power of the god behind them, they went into a frenzy. They attacked the men who barely escaped with their lives. Their weapons had no effect, whereas the thyrsus that the women held were inflicting grave wounds on these men. And then they ripped calves in half. They ripped cows to pieces. The bulls tried to attack them, and they tore them down to the ground and ripped their flesh from their bones in a matter of seconds. They kidnapped some of the babies from the town. Some of the women were seen suckling wild animals at their breasts. So it's all this poetic imagery. The messenger related to the king. He said, okay, enough of this. I'm going to get my heavily armored troops, the real ones who go to battle, and we're going to go out there and cast them in iron nets. And I'll put an end to this obscene disorder. And then Dionysus says, oh, but wouldn't you rather see what you perceive to be these drunken orgies? And he immediately flips and says, I'd pay a great amount to see that sight. Why are you so passionately curious? Dionysus asks. And Pentheus says, well, it would be a shame to see them drunk. So it's kind of got Oedipal overtones because his own mother is out there as well as his aunts, and he thinks they're drunk and naked and having an orgy, and now he's very curious to go see it. And then Dionysus says, well, you'll have to dress as one of them, as a woman. Otherwise, if they see you, they'll tear you to shreds. And then he says, no way, I'm not dressing as a woman. That's too much. And then Dionysus says, okay, well, I guess you don't want to see them. So he's torn. He goes, well, let me think about it. He leaves the stage, and while he's gone, Dionysus says, sane of mind, this man would never dress as a woman, but insane and driven mad by the god, he will. And he comes back, and he says, okay, you've convinced me. And they dress him up as a maenad. He puts a wig on, and he's looking at the hem of his dress to make sure it looks just right. He's kind of primping and starting to act like a woman. And this is all part of the plan of Dionysus. And then he walks him out to Mount Cithron, and Pentheus says, oh, there they are, but I can't see them clearly. Maybe if I got on top of this pine tree, I'd be able to see their orgies better. So Dionysus bends the pine tree down slowly, puts him on top, like a pine cone on a thyrsus, and he lets it slowly bend back up so he doesn't get catapulted out to space. And then as soon as he's up there, the maenads see him. Beginning with his own mother. They try to throw rocks from a nearby cliff, and they can't hit him, so eventually they rip the tree down by its roots. And as it comes falling down, he's screaming, and he hits the ground. He knows he's about to be ripped to shreds. He puts his hand on his mother's cheek. He says, Mother, please, it's me, your own son. I did wrong, but don't kill me. She thinks he's a mountain lion cub, and she grabs his arm, puts her foot on his chest, and rips his arm out of the socket. And then his aunts tear the flesh off of him, pull his foot off, and then all the other women rip all the flesh off of his bones, and they're passing his flesh back and forth like a ball. It's a gruesome scene. His body parts are in the bushes scattered throughout the forest. And then Agave, Pentheus's mother, puts his head on her top of her thyrsus, marches back to town proudly thinking that she killed a mountain lion cub with her bare hands, and she's bragging about what a great hunter she is, how she's better than the men who need weapons, and then she says, where's my father Cadmus? Where's my son Pentheus? They should come and honor my great kill. They should be proud of me. And then Cadmus, who had been out on the mountain with Tiresias, returns, followed by some servants who have all of Pentheus's body parts, as many as they could gather, on some kind of a stretcher. And he sees his daughter, and he realizes she's been driven mad by the god. And so he tries to slowly bring her back to sanity. He says, what do you have there on your thyrsus? She says, a mountain lion cub's head. He says, are you sure? Why don't you take a closer look? And she takes a peek, and then she quickly looks away, and she realizes it's not a mountain lion cub. She says, what is that? And he says, it's your son Pentheus's head. What am I doing with it? And he explains to her what happened. The god came to avenge his mother's good name, whom Agave had blasphemed, and to prove that he's a god. Then Dionysus shows up and he says, Agave, you're polluted. You killed your own son, even though he induced her to do it. You have to leave the town. You're exiled. And Cadmus, if you'd watched your tongue, you'd have had an ally in Dionysus. But as it is, because of that talk about the noble lie, you're going to be transformed into a snake along with your wife Harmonia. You'll be pulled behind an ox cart. Hordes of barbarian armies will follow you, and you'll conquer Greek cities. But when you topple the temple of Apollo, that'll be the end of you. But then at the end of your life, you'll be divinized. So he's rewarded and punished. And that correlates to his speaking out of both sides of his mouth, praising Dionysus as a god, at the same time alluding to the fact that maybe it's a noble lie. And this is all pertinent to the Republic, where the idea of a noble lie is brought up. And then the Asian Bacchae at the end say, the god has many ways to get things done. What everyone expected didn't happen, but the god brought the unexpected to pass. Something to that effect. So there's the Bacchae. Here's the parallel with the Republic. So at the beginning of the Bacchae, you have Dionysus arriving on the scene, and then you have Tiresias and Cadmus dressed as maenads, and then Pentheus comes in blustering and angry, and ultimately he sends his slaves, his soldier slaves, out to arrest Dionysus. At the beginning of the Republic, it's Socrates recalling a previous day's events to an unknown audience and saying, I went down to the Piraeus with Glaucon to see the festival of the goddess. So the Piraeus is a port town about 5 miles southwest of Athens. And there was a festival for a goddess who Alan Bloom, the translation that I use primarily in the master's thesis here for Georgetown, equates with the Greek goddess Artemis. He said it's the Thracian goddess Bendis, and the Greeks correlated her with Artemis, which is important because Artemis was the one who had Actaeon torn to shreds by his own dogs, which is what Cadmus warned his son King Pentheus would happen to him if he didn't honor the god Dionysus. So after the festival, they were getting ready to leave. Glaucon, who's one of Plato's older brothers, and then Polemarchus, a wealthy young aristocrat whose father was Cephalus, and they lived down in that port town, sent a slave boy to hold on to Socrates' cloak and say, Polemarchus orders you to wait. So he places him under arrest, which is similar to the way King Pentheus sent a soldier out to arrest Dionysus. Now Socrates and Glaucon, they wait. When Polemarchus arrives with his group of young men, they say, either you see how many of us are and how few of you there are, either prove stronger than us or come with us. I'll take you to my house, we'll have dinner, we'll have conversation. And then Socrates implied he didn't want to go, and he says, well, what if I tried to talk you out of it? And then one of the members of the group said, well, what if we don't listen? So the symbolic situation is that the politically powerful people have power over the politically weak philosophers. Socrates is placed under arrest. Now, a very important point to keep in mind while reading the Republic, especially when looking for this parallel with the Bacchae, is that Polemarchus, who is the son of Cephalus, had already been executed in the Piraeus by the so-called 30 tyrants before Plato wrote the Republic. So, Athens and Sparta were engaged in the Peloponnesian War. Socrates fought in that war valiantly, but ultimately Sparta won. And then they supported a group of Athenians who were oligarchs, wealthy aristocrats. They helped them overthrow the democratic government of Athens. And the stronghold of the democracy was in the Piraeus. And that is where Polemarchus was killed by the 30 tyrants, the leaders of this oligarchically led army. And one of the leaders of the 30 tyrants was it Critias? Critias, who was Plato's uncle. And another member of the 30 was Charmides, who was Plato's cousin. And these Critias and Charmides were also both students of Socrates. Socrates was killed in 399 BCE on the charges of corrupting the youth and believing in gods of his own invention instead of the gods of the state. But the suspicion is that the charges of corrupting the youth were related to the suspected influence he had over the 30 tyrants, especially Critias and Charmides. And they weren't allowed to charge him with that because there was an amnesty declared. If the 30 tyrants agreed to leave power, then there'd be an amnesty. No one could bring charges up against them. Nevertheless, it is suspected that they did bring up charges against Socrates because they suspected he was an enemy of democracy. And in the Republic, he certainly does place democracy low down on the scale of the proper types of regime. It's one step above tyranny, and it inevitably leads to tyranny, says Socrates in the Republic. So, Polemarchus sent a slave boy to arrest Socrates in the end, just like King Pentheus sent his soldier to arrest Dionysus in the beginning of the Bacchae, in the beginning of the Republic. There's an arrest that is made of Dionysus on the one hand and Socrates on the other. At the end of the Bacchae, King Pentheus is ripped to shreds by Dionysus's devotees, the Maenads, the Theban women who he drove mad. There's no killing of Polemarchus at the end of the Republic, but the historical fact is that by the time Plato wrote the Republic, Polemarchus had already been killed there in the Piraeus, where they were having this conversation. Maybe it wasn't in that exact house, but it was in that town. And that is the end toward which the Republic inevitably leads. Okay, so in the Republic, Socrates eventually goes back to the house, and there he finds Cephalus, who is Polemarchus's old father, very old, getting ready to die. It's a theme that they talk about his extreme age. It's very similar to the extreme age of King Pentheus's father, Cadmus. Cadmus had ivy wreath around his head, and he was dressed as a Maenad, dappled fawn skin. Similarly, Cephalus is described as having a wreath on his head, and he has just been doing sacrifices for the gods. And he's extremely old. And then Socrates comes in, who I'm saying in this scene also represents a bit Tiresias. They're both old. And Cadmus, Cephalus, who I'm saying is a parallel to Cadmus, warmly welcomes Socrates. Socrates, we don't see you down here in the Piraeus that often. You should come here more often. And they start to talk. They talk about old age. Socrates says, "Oh, you've reached a ripe old age. Can you give us any advice? We're all curious. Like someone who's gone down a road we all must go eventually. What do you say?" He says, "Old age isn't so bad as long as you've got money, because then, as you start to fear the afterlife," which I used to laugh at these stories of an afterlife and Hades and all of the gods, but now I'm getting older, I'm starting to think maybe it's true, and now I'm performing sacrifices to pay off my debts and my sins so that I'll have a better afterlife. And they get to talking about what is justice. And Cephalus says, justice is giving back what you owe and telling the truth. And then his son Polemarchus agrees that that's true. And then Socrates says, yeah, that sounds to be about right usually. But what if the person that lent you, for example, a sword, in the meantime, goes insane, goes mad? Would it be just to give the madman the sword back or tell him the truth? No, I guess you're right. In that instance, it wouldn't. But you know what, Socrates, I got to get back to my sacrifices. And off he goes, and he says, Polemarchus, you'll have to inherit the conversation, just like he's going to inherit the whole household. So then Polemarchus says, yeah, that's right, giving what's owed and telling the truth. And Socrates brings up the same thing about, well, what if your friend has gone mad? Is it? And that's an important point, because Socrates is saying that you young men here have gone mad. You've placed me under arrest, and you want me to give you rhetorical tools because what you really want is the power to use language to become tyrants. And that is what one of the members of the group there, Thrasymachus, is there to teach them. But this emphasis on not telling the truth to madmen is important, because Socrates is going to be deceiving them throughout the rest of the Republic by secretly drawing them down the sacrificial pattern of the ritualistic scapegoat path that Dionysus led Pentheus. And so we're going to get into, in subsequent videos, all of the details of the Orphic ritual beliefs and how to free the soul from the cycle of reincarnation through material bodies. But I just want to focus on the basics of the plot parallel in this video. So Thrasymachus then lunges at him like a beast as if to tear us to pieces, says Socrates. So the imagery of tearing people to pieces is important. So the Orphic version of the myth, which I'll briefly discuss right now, of the secret mystery schools that existed, such as the Pythagorean mystery school and the Orphics. They were openly secret religious societies, kind of like the Freemasons today. They said, we are here, we're a religious group, but we have secrets that only our initiated disciples are privy to. And so what's been gathered by scholars about what these secret myths were about, it is suspected they were about a different version of the birth of Dionysus. In that Orphic version, he was born to the demigoddess Persephone, who was the wife of Hades. He abducted her and raped her, made her his wife. She had, as a result, Dionysus. But Zeus's sister bride, Hera, just like in the public version of the myth, wanted to have Dionysus killed. But rather than tricking the mother of Dionysus into asking Zeus to show her his original form as a lightning bolt, in the Orphic version, she gets the Titans, which is the previous order of the gods who were overthrown by Zeus, who then established the Olympian order of the gods on Mount Olympus. So the older order of the gods were called the Titans. And they lured baby Dionysus out with a mirror and different toys, which I'll talk about in different videos in this series. And they ripped him to shreds and they ate him. Just like King Pentheus had been ripped to shreds by the Maenads. They didn't eat him, but in the Orphic version, the Titans did eat baby Dionysus after tearing him to pieces, and then Zeus incinerated them with a lightning bolt. And from those ashes, the human species is born, and we are mostly of the titanic nature. And therefore, we carry this blood guilt of murdering Dionysus. But at the same time, because the Titans had devoured Dionysus, we all contain a little speck of Dionysus. That's our eternal soul, and it reincarnates through all different types of species. And the way to get out of the cycle of reincarnation is to worship the god Dionysus. Dancing and singing for the god is the preferred method. So getting back to this plot parallel in the Republic, Thrasymachus says, this isn't justice, that's foolishness, Socrates. Why don't you tell us what it is? I'm tired of your ironic ways. You never give a straight answer. You only pick apart other people's answers, but you never give any wisdom of your own. And then Socrates says, well, I'm not wise enough. I don't know. I'm not qualified to tell you what justice is. But why don't you tell us, Thrasymachus? And then he says, well, if I do, what penalty will you get for not telling what it is? And Socrates says, I'll pay the penalty of learning from you. And he goes, no, I want some money too. And then Glaucon says, who's Plato's older brother and a wealthy aristocrat, okay, fine, Thrasymachus, we'll put up money for Socrates if you're right and your definition of justice is better than his. And so for the sake of money, speak. So then Thrasymachus, who wants to be hired to teach rhetoric and how to teach people to be a tyrant, says justice is the advantage of the stronger. Might makes right. Whoever has the political power makes the laws. Obeying the law is just. And that's reality. Real politic. It's Machiavellian. That's reality. All these other definitions of justice is giving what's a fair share to everybody and telling the truth. That's just what weak people say as a compromise. They'd rather be tyrants, but since they don't feel strong enough, they agree amongst each other, hey, let's just be nice to each other. But if they had the power, they would take the advantage of everybody else. That's what Thrasymachus says. And that is what the young men who are there gathered around in the Piraeus in Polemarchus's house are being tempted with. They want to be tyrants. Why not? Why not take the lion's share of everything if you can get away with it, if you're smart enough? That's what the debate is going to be about. So Socrates pokes holes in Thrasymachus's argument. For example, he says, if justice is always taken the advantage if you can, but that's not possible, for example, in a band of thieves. There has to be honor among thieves. Otherwise, they'll tear each other to pieces and they'll never be able to conspire to get anything done. So he dismantles Thrasymachus's arguments enough to make him blush. And then Thrasymachus becomes petulant and tells Socrates, you need a wet nurse. These are childish definitions, but he keeps getting bested in this dialectical game of reasoning. And so eventually he just goes along with Socrates and he says, I'll tell you whatever you want to hear. And they talk about justice. And then Glaucon and his brother Adimantas, who are both Plato's older brothers, more or less take over the conversation. And they tell Socrates, let's take each argument to its extreme, yours and his. Yours is that justice is, somehow beneficial to everybody. And his definition of justice is that it's only beneficial to the strong who can take whatever they're strong enough to take. They talk about a myth of a man who found a ring. There was an earthquake and it opened up a chasm underground and he found this hollowed out horse with a giant inside dead and he had a ring on his finger. They took the ring off and the guy put it on his own finger and he realized it made him invisible when he turned it a certain way. And then he raped the king's wife, killed the king, became this super uber tyrant. And so Plato's brothers want to know, if justice is good, what about if someone had that ring? Nobody would be just. They would be evil if they could be. And then he says, explain to us the ultimate extremes of both cases. A just man who's thought to be unjust and an entirely unjust man who has a reputation for justice. In that instance, would the truly just man still be happier than the unjust man? And then they begin to examine what is justice. And Socrates comes up with the idea of creating a just city-state, which is like an individual soul amplified to a larger degree. And the pattern of the individual is easier to see in the larger city. And then they can find justice in the ideal city and see if it correlates to justice in the individual soul. Very well. Let's do it. The first city Socrates imagines is a simple city where everyone takes care of their basic needs. You have a shoemaker and a farmer and people who take care of trade, and it's just the basics of a functioning city-state. And it culminates culturally with the people laying out blankets on a field, assembling with their children, having a vegetarian feast, then crowned with wreaths of ivy and sipping wine, they sing of the gods together. It's very Orphic. That's the ideal just city, says Socrates. Then Glaucon says, that's a city fit for pigs, Socrates. Where's the relishes? Where's the luxuries? And Socrates kind of comically says, oh, luxuries. Okay, well, we'll have acorns and relishes and some other simple, like a little bit more special natural foods. And then Glaucon says, no, I'm talking about couches and other things. And Socrates says, oh, you mean a feverish state with luxuries like meats and pastries and courtesans. Yeah, jewelry. Oh, I got you. Okay. Very well. If you want to make a feverish city, we can do that too. And then he begins to develop the feverish city, and he tries to compensate for the sin associated with wealth and luxury by establishing this elite core of guardians, who he frequently refers to as hunting dogs, which is a big parallel with the Maenads in the Bacchae. So the craftsmen and the farmers can have wealth, but the ruling elite are going to be the Spartan communistic group who are trained to fight and to philosophize. And we're going to see in Book 5 of the Republic the huge parallel with the Bacchae, because the men and the women exercise naked together, and furthermore, and they fight together in the field. Socrates says to Glaucon, oh, you like to raise hunting dogs, and you mate the best with the best, and do you not use the female dogs for hunting? Is it only the male dogs? And then Glaucon says, no, the female dogs come hunting too. They're not quite as strong and fast, but they're still useful in the hunt. And Socrates says, well, similarly, the women will fight with the men, and they'll exercise naked together. In Athens, the men exercise naked together in the gymnasium. Socrates says, and the women in our ideal state will exercise with the men, and they won't have any private property. And furthermore, we're going to use a noble lie and tell them that the childhoods they had were just a dream. And in fact, they were under the ground, being formed by the god with one of 4 metals in their soul: gold, silver, and iron and bronze. And the gold, if the god intermingled gold with your soul while you were underground, then you'll be one of the rulers. If the god intermingled silver, then you'll be one of the auxiliary helpers of the rulers, the army. And if it's either iron or bronze, you'll be a craftsman or a farmer. And no one will know exactly who's mother and father, or brother and sister. So if you were born in a certain time, then everyone else born near that time will be a brother and a sister, and they can extrapolate and kind of figure out roughly who's who. You know, certain groups of people were most likely the parents of these groups of people, but it won't be perfect. Incest will occur. It's admitted occasionally. So the big parallel I'm saying with the Bacchae is the Maenads were referred to as dogs. They refer to themselves as dogs, hounds who hunt with me, hunting dogs. Pentheus thought they were naked and drunk out on Mount Cithron having an orgy. Now in the Republic, they're not drunk, the women, but they are referred to as hunting dogs, and they do exercise naked with the men, and they fight. And furthermore, occasionally they have incestuous sex, which is all the things that Pentheus was fascinated with. And so let me just backtrack a little bit. That's Book 5, which is this huge parallel with the Bacchae. But in book, what is this? I'm looking at this. Book 2, they start to talk about what kind of stories they need to teach the elite of this leading group in the ideal but feverish city. And he says we need to evict all of the tragic and comic playwrights, and especially Euripides, he'll say later, I believe it's Book 10, because they praise tyranny. And they talk about gods disguising themselves and lying to people. And so we'll have to get rid of those. No comedies, no tragedies. And then later, Euripides in particular is evicted. So the great irony there is Plato has Socrates luring these young men through the same tragic plot that Euripides portrayed in the Bacchae, featuring Dionysus disguising himself as a human and lying to a young man to lure him to his death. So point for point, the surface reading of the Republic is inverted by the parallel with the Bacchae. So that was in books 2 and 3. In book 5, you have this image of the naked men and women hunting dog, fighting and incest that's so similar to what King Pentheus thought he was going to see. Another thing that's important to note is that I forgot to mention is that when Pentheus in the Bacchae started to go crazy after Dionysus initiated the earthquake and freed himself from the prison, he looked at Dionysus and he says, I seem to see 2 suns and 2 Thebes, and you are a bull, he says to Dionysus. Dionysus is correlated to the image of a bull, one of the many religious symbols of the god. But 2 suns and 2 Thebes. Returning now to the Republic, after book 5, then Socrates says, now I'm going to bring the greatest wave of laughter. And when I tell you this, before I tell you, it was funny enough to hear that I'm saying the men and the women should exercise naked together and the implications of the incest. But the really crazy thing I'm about to tell you, but I'm not going to tell you because I'm afraid I'll be guilty of involuntary homicide. And he mentions that 3 times, involuntary homicide. And every time Glaucon is saying, don't worry, just tell us what you're going to say. We relieve you of the guilt of involuntary homicide. Now remember, I'm saying, and scholars have said, that Socrates was ultimately executed on suspicion of influencing the 30 tyrants who killed Polemarchus. So kind of involuntary homicide is what Socrates was more or less being charged with. He didn't kill Polemarchus, but he induced his young disciples, who then went mad and did do that. So that Socrates 3 times says, I'm not going to tell you. And he finally does, and he says, very well, until philosophers become kings or kings become philosophers, there'll be no justice in the world. So that doesn't seem like quite as big of a crazy thing to say to us, but apparently back then it was. And so then he continues the education of this elite group who have been told this noble lie about being formed underground with these metals in their soul to form this caste system. The rulers in the upper echelon of the elite have to use all these noble lies. So Socrates said in book 2, we're not going to let stories be taught to our children and deform their souls about gods who lie. However, it's necessary for humans to lie sometimes as a drug to cure madness. When people are insane, they need to be told certain lies. We'll have to have use of a whole throng of lies, he says. So he contradicts himself. Another thing he says is we need to train these rulers and put them to the test. Can they be tricked by wizardry or force? Can they be deluded by pleasures or tricked into losing their idea of what's good for the city by fear? And then he goes on to tempt these young men with all kinds of things like becoming the philosopher king, which I'm arguing is kind of like tempting, like Dionysus tempted Pentheus when he says, oh, you're going to be towering to the heavens. You're going to be a great man. They're going to talk about you. And then he puts him on top of this pine tree, and then he's towering to heaven, and then he gets ripped to shreds, a scapegoat of the god. Socrates tempts these young men to see themselves as the philosopher king, this archetypal human being who's transcended attachment for the material world by using reason to discover the eternal forms from which the temporary material forms are projected. It includes a mathematical curriculum which systematically studies the ascending dimensions of space and time. And the cave allegory is the most famous description of this 2 worlds theory. So King Pentheus saw 2 suns in 2 cities of Thebes, which I believe is an allusion to the cave allegory, where Socrates says we're all like prisoners in a cave in the material world, watching shadows cast on the back wall projected by a fire, and guards carry puppets back and forth behind a a mediary wall, and the shadows of the puppets are cast on the back wall, and the prisoners see their own shadows and the shadows of the puppets, and they mistake them for the totality of reality. And there's someone from outside comes down, frees a prisoner, turns him around. He's blinded by the firelight. He can't see anything. He's hauled up outside. He still can't see anything because the light of the sun blinds him. Eventually, he can see reflections of things in puddles of water. Then he can look at things in broad daylight, and eventually he can take a glimpse at the sun itself and realize that that's the source of everything. So then Socrates says, as the world outside the cave is analogous to the spiritual world where the eternal forms are, and this three-dimensional material world is like a cave of shadows. And the sun is a dim reflection of the ultimate idea of the good, the spiritual sun, which is the source of all being. You have to open the eye of the soul to the idea of the good, and then you'll be a philosopher king and you can rule a city justly. And then we go, that's books 6 and 7, and then there's the myth of which is the near-death experience of a soldier named who wakes up on his own funeral pyre and recalls what he saw in the afterlife, where he saw the three fates sewing the threads of destiny of each soul out into the outermost circumference of the universe, and then through each planetary orbit centered on the Earth. It's a geocentric model, and we'll talk about that. But the ultimate end of the Republic is the execution of Polemarchus in the Piraeus, which is what historically happened. So there's the plot parallels that I'm arguing Plato included between the Republic and the Bacchae. And when you see that, you have a literary model of the idea of the good, the complementarity of the idea of the good, mutually exclusive but complementary interpretations of the same thing. There's many implications of this literary parallel, which I'll be discussing, and there's implications that I'm not even aware of, that I hope other people will communicate in the comments section. So this is just the beginning of a series of videos, and we'll get back into the details of Gore's accusations against Plato. But one of them is he's saying Plato infected the earth with this earth-hating mentality that causes us to devour the earth to compensate for our missing spiritual relationship with it. This plot parallel with the Bacchae features Dionysus, the ultimate nature god, and it perfectly compensates the earth-despising attitude that we see exemplified, for example, in the cave allegory. Okay, with that, I will conclude this first video in the series.